How does one exist without a conscience, without the visceral pang of empathy or the searing burn of remorse? How does a human being navigate the intricate tapestry of relationships, responsibilities, and moral choices when the very threads of connection and ethical grounding seem absent from their inner world? The questions surrounding psychopathy confront us with a chilling paradox. A human form devoid of what many consider fundamental human attributes: compassion, guilt, and the capacity for genuine love. It is a phenomenon that challenges our deepest assumptions about human nature, forcing us to peer into an abyss of the unfelt, the unacknowledged, and the profoundly disconnected. This essay embarks on an exploration of the inner psychology of psychopaths, not merely as a clinical diagnosis, but as a profound spiritual riddle. We will delve into the psychological mechanisms that underpin this condition, examining the roles of neurobiology, developmental factors, and cognitive patterns. Simultaneously, we will turn to the rich traditions of spiritual wisdom, from Buddhist teachings on suffering and the self, to Christian contemplative insights on the heart and conscience, Sufi perspectives on the ego and divine remembrance, and existential philosophies grappling with authenticity and responsibility. By integrating these disparate yet complementary lenses, we aim to uncover not only the scientific understanding of psychopathy, but also its deeper spiritual implications for both the individual and humanity as a whole. Our journey will seek to understand what it means to live without an inner compass, what spiritual traditions might reveal about such a state of being, and what lessons the shadow of psychopathy holds for our collective healing and awakening. At its core, psychopathy is a personality construct characterized by a constellation of interpersonal, affective, and behavioral deficits. Unlike the broader and often interchangeably used term antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, from the DSM-5, which primarily focuses on observable antisocial behaviors, psychopathy delves deeper into the personality traits that drive these behaviors. The most influential diagnostic tool, Dr. Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist Revised (PCLR), identifies two key factors that delineate this complex condition. Factor 1. Interpersonal affective traits. This factor captures the core emotional and interpersonal deficits inherent in psychopathy. Individuals scoring high on Factor 1 exhibit a profound lack of empathy, a callous disregard for the feelings and suffering of others. They are often superficially charming, possessing a remarkable ability to mimic emotions and social cues, which they skillfully employ to manipulate and deceive those around them. This charm, however, masks a genuine emotional void. Pathological lying is common, not typically out of fear of consequences, but as a calculated tool for control and exploitation. Crucially, they feel no remorse or guilt for their actions, regardless of the harm inflicted, viewing others as mere objects to be used for their own gratification. This emotional poverty, an inner landscape barren of genuine connection and moral distress, is arguably the most defining and disturbing feature of psychopathy. Neuroscientific research, as we will explore in later sections, points to specific brain regions, particularly the amygdala and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, showing reduced activity or atypical connectivity in psychopaths when processing emotional stimuli, especially fear and sadness in others. This biological underpinning suggests a fundamental difference in how they experience and respond to the emotional world. Factor 2. Social deviance lifestyle traits. Factor 2 describes the behavioral manifestations that often accompany the core affective deficits, including impulsivity, irresponsibility, a parasitic lifestyle, juvenile delinquency, and a persistent pattern of antisocial behavior. While these behaviors overlap significantly with the diagnostic criteria for ASPD, In psychopathy, they are often driven by the underlying affective and interpersonal deficits of factor 1. The impulsivity is not merely a lack of self-control, but a consequence of a fundamental inability to anticipate or care about negative outcomes for others. Their parasitic lifestyle stems from a willingness to exploit others without compunction, and their irresponsibility is rooted in a self-centered worldview where rules and obligations apply only when convenient or strategically advantageous. The prevalence of psychopathy in the general population is estimated at around 1%, but it is significantly higher in incarcerated populations, reaching 15 to 25%. Hare, 2003. It is crucial to understand that psychopathy is not a mental illness in the traditional sense, where a person experiences distress or a break from reality. Instead, it is a stable personality organization, a way of being in the world that is often ego-syntonic, meaning it aligns with the individual's self-perception and causes them little to no internal suffering. Psychopaths typically do not suffer from their condition. It is those around them who bear the brunt of their internal emptiness and external predation. From a spiritual perspective, the psychological profile of a psychopath presents a profound enigma. If spiritual traditions universally point towards the development of compassion, the purification of the heart, and the recognition of interconnectedness as pathways to wholeness and liberation, then psychopathy appears to represent a direct antithesis. The absence of empathy and remorse, the inability to genuinely connect, and the profound self-centeredness could be seen as a state of deep spiritual deprivation, an unfelt self, unable to access the very core of human spiritual potential. Many spiritual paths speak of the heart not merely as a biological organ, but as the seat of consciousness, emotion, and spiritual insight. In Christian mysticism, the heart is often described as the dwelling place of God and the source of conscience. In Sufism, it is the mirror reflecting divine attributes, capable of being polished or clouded. In Buddhism, it is the source of metta, loving kindness, and karuna, compassion, essential for awakening. For the psychopath, this spiritual heart appears dormant, or perhaps entirely absent in its capacity for genuine warmth and connection. This is not merely a lack of outward expression, but an intrinsic void, a failure to register the suffering of others or to feel the inner stirrings of conscience. This initial spiritual framing suggests that psychopathy might be understood as a profound form of spiritual darkness, or an arrested development of the soul. It raises questions about the nature of evil, free will, and the potential for spiritual transformation in individuals who seem inherently predisposed to a path of disconnection. While psychology offers a framework for diagnosis and understanding, spirituality invites us to contemplate the deeper existential and moral dimensions of a mind that operates outside the shared human experience of empathy and ethical concern. This dual perspective will guide our ongoing exploration, seeking to illuminate both the clinical realities and the profound spiritual question posed by the psychopathic mind. Our initial foray into the intricate landscape of psychopathy revealed a profound chasm, a formidable void where the foundational pillars of human connection, empathy, remorse, and genuine affection should reside. This is not merely an absence, we contend, but an active, almost defiant, unfelt state, presenting a paradox that challenges the very bedrock of our understanding of consciousness and spiritual being. It compels us to confront the unsettling possibility that the human experience as most of us know it may not be universally shared. What does it signify truly to navigate existence devoid of the visceral pang of guilt that twists the stomach after a transgression, the searing burn of conscience that demands accountability, or the tender ache of compassion that binds us to the suffering of another? How does the inner world of an individual appear when its most essential chambers, those designed for resonance with the suffering and joy of others, for the warmth of shared vulnerability, stand perpetually vacant, echoing only a chilling silence, a stark and desolate emptiness where the vibrant symphony of human emotion ought to play? This unfelt state is not a passive lack, but an active rejection, an internal architecture configured to resist and repel the very elements that define our shared humanity. Clinically, this emptiness manifests as a constellation of interpersonal and affective deficits, so pervasive they reconfigure the entire psychical architecture, creating a persona that is both compelling and utterly hollow. We observe a superficial charm, often disarmingly potent, which serves as a sophisticated facade, a shimmering veil drawn over an internal barrenness. This charm is not an expression of genuine warmth or interest. Rather, it is a finely honed instrument of manipulation, deployed with a calculated precision to disarm, to extract, to control. Imagine a master artisan meticulously crafting an illusion, not out of passion for beauty, but for the sole purpose of ensnaring. The psychopath in this regard becomes a master puppeteer, perceiving others not as fellow travellers on life's journey, individuals with their own rich inner lives and vulnerabilities, but as mere extensions of their own will, objects to be utilised, discarded, or even destroyed, without a flicker of internal distress. There is no tremor in the hand, no catch in the breath, no shadow of hesitation in their decision to inflict pain if it serves their purpose. This instrumentalization of humanity is a hallmark of their being, underpinning their pathological lying and deceit. Each falsehood is not a deviation from truth, but a strategic maneuver in a relentless game of acquisition, whether of power, pleasure, or material gain. The lie is not a momentary lapse, but a foundational brick in their constructed reality, a tool as vital as any other. The absence of remorse or guilt, so alien to the neurotypical mind, liberates them from the ethical constraints that govern most human interactions, the unspoken rules of fairness, reciprocity, and care for another's well-being, allowing for a boundless capacity for exploitation. They are in essence players in a game with rules only they perceive, where all others are pawns. From a spiritual vantage, this emotional desolation is profoundly unsettling. If the heart, as many spiritual traditions posit, is the seat of the soul, the locus of divine remembrance and the crucible of compassion, what then becomes of a heart that remains impervious to the suffering of others, unresponsive to the cries of the world? Consider the teachings that speak of the heart's capacity for expansion, for purification, for becoming a mirror reflecting the divine light. We are confronted with the image of a spiritual heart that appears dormant, perhaps even calcified, encased in an impenetrable shell, incapable of the purification or expansion that spiritual paths universally advocate. It is a heart that does not break at injustice, nor swell with love at beauty, nor ache with empathy for loss. This abyss of the unfelt is not simply a psychological construct. It represents a radical departure from the interconnectedness that defines our spiritual essence, the fundamental understanding that we are all the threads in the same cosmic tapestry. Where we anticipate the mirror reflecting divine attributes, love, mercy, wisdom, we encounter a surface that absorbs all light, returning nothing, a black hole of the spirit, drawing in warmth and life, yet radiating only cold emptiness. The psychopathic individual exists in a perpetual present, untethered by past regrets and unburdened by future consequences, at least in the moral sense. For them, the past is merely a data set for future manipulation, and the future a canvas for their desires, devoid of the weight of ethical considerations. Their impulsivity and irresponsibility, frequently observed in clinical profiles, are direct outgrowths of this affective void. Without the capacity for anticipatory fear, the subtle dread that warns a neurotypical individual of potential harm to themselves or others, or the empathetic understanding of how their actions might harm others, the immediate gratification of desire becomes the sole, unyielding arbiter of behaviour. This is not a lapse in judgment, a momentary error. It is a fundamental operating principle, a core tenet of their existence. Why wait, the internal logic dictates? Why hesitate when the prize is within reach and the consequences are merely someone else's problem? The parasitic lifestyle often adopted by psychopaths further underscores this profound objectification of others. Relationships are transactional, a means to an end, never an end in themselves. They feed upon the resources, emotions, and vulnerabilities of those around them, leaving behind a trail of devastation, shattered trust, financial ruin, emotional wreckage, yet experiencing no internal suffering, no searing burn of conscience that might prompt a re-evaluation of their path. The landscape of their wake is littered with broken lives, but their internal world remains pristine, untouched by the ruin they sow. This brings us back to the crucial concept of psychopathy being egosyntonic. Unlike mental illnesses that inflict distress upon the individual, leading to a yearning for relief and often a pursuit of therapy, psychopathy is a condition entirely congruent with the individual's sense of self. The psychopath does not suffer from their psychopathy. They are their psychopathy. There is no internal conflict, no longing for empathy, no desire for remorse. For them, their way of being is not merely acceptable but optimal. Why would one seek to cultivate emotions they perceive as weaknesses or hindrances, burdensome sentiments that only complicate efficient acquisition and control? Why would one strive for connection when manipulation yields greater perceived control and superior outcomes from their utilitarian viewpoint? This inherent lack of perceived deficit renders traditional therapeutic approaches largely ineffective, as the fundamental motivation for change, the alleviation of internal suffering, is entirely absent. A therapist might speak of emotional depth, of genuine connection, of the richness of shared experience, but to the psychopath, these concepts are abstract, perhaps even nonsensical, certainly not desirable. We are left with the chilling realization that the very mechanism designed for spiritual awakening, the profound yearning for connection, for truth, for love, for something beyond the self, is simply not activated within this unique psychological architecture. It is as if the spiritual antennae are missing or perpetually tuned to a frequency that carries no signal of the sacred. Herein lies one of the most profound spiritual riddles posed by psychopathy. If the path to spiritual growth often begins with self-awareness, with the recognition of one's own imperfections and the desire for purification of the heart, what hope exists for those who perceive no imperfection, feel no spiritual lack, and experience no yearning for such purification? If the initial spark of spiritual seeking is a discomfort with one's current state, a yearning for transcendence, then the psychopath, utterly content in their self-perceived perfection, remains untouched by such a call. Does free will in this context even extend to the choice of spiritual awakening? Or are certain individuals, by dint of their neurological and psychological predispositions, fundamentally sealed off from the experiential realm of the sacred, from the profound interconnectedness that spiritual traditions extol? These are not questions we can answer glibly, for they touch upon the very nature of human potential, moral responsibility, and the divine plan itself, pushing the boundaries of our theological and philosophical frameworks. They force us to consider whether the capacity for spiritual awakening is a universal birthright, or if for some the very architecture of their being precludes such a journey. The existence of psychopathy therefore serves as a potent, albeit disturbing, mirror for humanity. It compels us to examine the very qualities we often take for granted: our capacity for empathy, our internal moral compass, our inherent drive towards connection and altruism. What does it mean for us to possess these capacities, and how diligently do we cultivate them in a world that often rewards ruthless ambition? Do we in our own lives sometimes fall prey to lesser forms of objectification, manipulation, or emotional detachment, perhaps on a spectrum far removed from clinical psychopathy, but nonetheless indicative of a spiritual slackening, a subtle dulling of our own compassionate edge? The chilling presence of the psychopath among us forces a re-evaluation of our collective spiritual health, urging us to recognize the preciousness of our own capacity for love, for compassion, for the visceral pang that signals our shared humanity. It challenges us to protect and nurture these essential qualities, both within ourselves and within our societies, lest the abyss of the unfelt begin to creep, subtly and insidiously, into the broader human experience, eroding the very fabric of our moral and spiritual landscape. In the absence of a spiritual heart, responsive and alive, what truly remains of the human being? This question, haunting in its implications and echoing through the desolate chambers of the unfelt, will guide our continued exploration into the intricate tapestry of psychopathy's clinical realities and its enduring spiritual resonance. The disturbing mirror that psychopathy holds up to humanity is not merely a reflection of a monstrous other, but a profound challenge to our collective self-perception. It forces us to confront the very foundations of what we consider innately human: the capacity for empathy, the sting of remorse, the guiding hand of conscience. When we gaze into the abyss of the unfelt, we are compelled to ask, what separates us from this void, and how fragile are the threads of connection that bind us to one another? This inquiry leads us deeper into the internal landscape of the psychopath, a territory largely barren of the rich emotional foliage that defines typical human experience. For the psychopath, the absence of a conscience is not a burden or a source of suffering. Rather, it is a state of being, an egosyntonic reality that provides an unencumbered freedom from moral constraint. They do not feel the weight of their actions in the way others do. There is no visceral pang of guilt, no searing burn of regret. Instead, their internal world is often characterized by a stark instrumental rationality, where others are merely variables in an equation designed for their personal gratification or gain. Emotions, for them, are not deeply felt experiences that color their perception of reality or guide their moral compass. Rather, they are tools to be mimicked, manipulated, or exploited in others. They can intellectually comprehend the concept of sadness or joy, much like an actor understands a script, but the authentic, resonant experience remains alien. This cognitive understanding without effective resonance is a crucial distinction, highlighting a fundamental disjunction between knowing and feeling that shapes their entire existence. How then does this emotional impoverishment manifest in their self-perception and interaction with the world? Their sense of self is often inflated, grandiose, and impermeable to external criticism or introspection. They view themselves as superior, justified in their actions, and often entitled to whatever they desire. The world, in their perception, is a stage upon which they are the principal players, and everyone else is an extra, a prop, or a potential mark. This self-aggrandizement is not merely superficial charm, It is a deep-seated conviction that empowers their manipulative strategies. They navigate social interactions with an almost predatory efficiency, identifying vulnerabilities, mirroring desired traits, and weaving intricate webs of deceit, all without the slightest flicker of internal conflict or a moral hesitation. The thrill they experience is often tied to the successful execution of these maneuvers, the exercise of power, the domination of another's will, or the acquisition of desired resources. It is a gratification rooted in control and conquest, rather than genuine connection or shared joy. The concept of time and consequence, so central to moral development and societal order, also takes on a unique dimension within the psychopathic psyche. Unburdened by remorse for past misdeeds or anxiety about future repercussions, they exist predominantly in a perpetual present. The past is a collection of data points to be analysed for future strategies, and the future is an open field for exploitation. This temporal myopia, devoid of moral anchors, allows for an almost seamless transition from one manipulative act to the next, without the accumulating weight of guilt that would cripple a neurotypical individual. Each moment is an opportunity, each person a potential target, and the long-term implications of their actions rarely factor into their immediate calculus, unless those implications directly threaten their self-preservation or immediate desires. This lack of future orientation, coupled with their profound irresponsibility, paints a chilling portrait of an existence unmoored from the very concepts of accountability and legacy. From a spiritual perspective, this internal architecture presents an even more profound challenge. If the heart is indeed the seat of consciousness, compassion, and the capacity for divine remembrance across various spiritual traditions, what then can be said of the spiritual heart of the psychopath? We have posited it as dormant, calcified, or entirely absent in its capacity for genuine connection. But what does this truly entail for the journey of the soul? Many spiritual paths emphasize inner purification, the removal of veils from the heart to reveal an inherent divine light or primordial goodness, fitra. Yet if the underlying light is obscured to such an extent, or if the very organ of perception is malformed, what hope remains for such an awakening? The concept of nafs, or the ego self in certain traditions, offers a lens through which to consider the psychopathic condition. When the nafs is left unchecked, unpurified and untamed by higher spiritual principles, it can become a tyrannical force driven by base desires, arrogance, and an insatiable hunger for power and gratification. In psychopathy, we see the nafs in its most extreme and unbridled manifestation, devoid of the tempering influence of conscience or the softening touch of empathy. It is an ego that has become entirely self-serving, recognizing no authority higher than its own desires, and perceiving no inherent value in others beyond their utility. This raises the unsettling question: is psychopathy a condition where the nafs has so thoroughly dominated the spiritual essence that it has effectively extinguished or sealed off the potential for spiritual growth, or does the potential merely lie dormant, awaiting a catalyst that may never come? The very notion of repentance, a cornerstone of many spiritual traditions, becomes meaningless for an individual who perceives no fault, feels no remorse, and suffers no internal distress from their actions. The existence of psychopathy, therefore, forces us to re-examine our fundamental understanding of human nature, free will, and moral responsibility. If an individual is genuinely incapable of empathy, remorse, or guilt due to neurological and psychological predispositions, how do we assign moral blame? Is evil a choice, an illness, or an inherent state? This paradox challenges the very foundations of our justice systems, which are largely predicated on the assumption of a shared moral framework and the capacity for rehabilitation through punishment and introspection. For the psychopath, traditional punishment designed to evoke remorse and deter future transgressions often proves ineffective, serving only as an external inconvenience to be circumvented or endured, rather than an internal catalyst for change. The absence of internal suffering, the egosyntonic nature of their condition, means they do not seek or respond to therapy in the conventional sense. They see no problem to be fixed. This leaves society grappling with the profound ethical dilemma of how to protect itself from individuals who operate outside the very moral fabric that binds humanity, without resorting to dehumanization ourselves. Furthermore, psychopathy compels us to look inward, to acknowledge the shadow aspects within the collective human psyche. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow refers to the repressed, disowned, and often darker elements of our personality, instincts, desires, and weaknesses that we deny or project onto others. While most individuals strive to integrate or manage their shadow, the psychopath, in a chilling sense, is their shadow, fully embodied and unconstrained. They represent the terrifying potential of human nature when the checks and balances of conscience and empathy are entirely absent. This makes the psychopath a potent, albeit disturbing mirror, reflecting not just what we are, but what we could be, if our own shadow aspects were left unchecked, if our capacity for self-interest and aggression were allowed to run rampant without the tempering force of our higher moral faculties. This intellectual and spiritual odyssey into the inner psychology of psychopaths is, ultimately, an exploration of the boundaries of human experience. It pushes us to define what it truly means to be human, to understand the fragility of our moral compass, and to confront the uncomfortable truth that not all beings who walk among us share the same fundamental internal landscape. The questions raised by psychopathy concerning the nature of evil, the limits of empathy, the potential for spiritual dormancy, and the very structure of human consciousness remain some of the most profound and unsettling mysteries of our existence, demanding not easy answers, but sustained and rigorous inquiry. The spiritual riddle of psychopathy, then, extends far beyond mere psychological categorization. It plunges us into the very heart of what it means to be human, to possess a soul, or to engage in the arduous journey of spiritual refinement. It forces us to confront not just a deviation from the norm, but a radical redefinition of the human experience itself, raising questions that ripple through philosophy, theology, and our deepest existential understandings. We confront an ontological vacuum, an abyss of the unfelt, where the reverberations of conscience and the visceral pangs of empathy are conspicuously absent. Imagine a vast, silent chamber within the psyche, where the echoes of human suffering simply dissipate, leaving no trace, no emotional residue. There is no internal resonance, no sympathetic vibration to the distress of another, nor to the weight of one's own past transgressions. This absence, as we have meticulously explored, is not a source of distress for the psychopath. Their condition is profoundly egosyntonic, an integral, comfortable, and often advantageous aspect of their very being. It is not a burden they carry, but the very ground upon which they stand. They do not suffer from psychopathy. They are their psychopathy, a chillingly coherent and self-contained entity whose internal landscape is ordered with the logic that is alien to most. For them, this state is not a flaw to be corrected, but an inherent strength, a clarity of purpose unburdened by the messy complexities of human emotion. This fundamental ego-syntonicity presents perhaps the most insurmountable barrier to traditional notions of spiritual awakening or purification. If suffering is, for many spiritual traditions, the crucible of transformation, the catalyst for introspection, and the impetus toward divine remembrance, what then of the psychopath for whom this internal suffering is conspicuously absent? Consider the profound spiritual narratives woven around themes of repentance, redemption, and the hard-won wisdom born from regret, the anguish of a broken heart, the sting of guilt, the burning shame of betrayal. These are often the very fires that forge a deeper understanding of self and other, prompting a yearning for grace, for forgiveness, for a higher path. But in the psychic landscape of the psychopath, these fires simply do not ignite. Can a heart that feels no ache ever yearn for healing? Is the absence of suffering a liberation, or the ultimate imprisonment, a gilded cage of self-referential logic from which there is no desire to escape? One might envision this cage as shimmering and attractive, offering boundless freedom from emotional constraint, a world where every action is dictated solely by personal utility. Yet it is a cage nonetheless, one that fundamentally denies access to the very spiritual dimensions that define humanity for many. The very concept of purification of the heart, central to many esoteric paths, presupposes an acknowledgement of impurity, a recognition of flaws, and a yearning for a higher state. All sentiments foreign to the psychopath's inner landscape. For them, there is no spiritual deficit to rectify, no moral compass to recalibrate, no perceived imperfection to transcend. Their world is already, in their estimation, perfectly ordered. Their desires an instrumental rationality, a pristine, unblemished reflection of their own self-serving will. Why seek to purify what one perceives as already pure, already perfectly aligned with their understanding of existence? This leads us to a profound, almost terrifying epistemological quandary concerning the nature of free will in spiritual development. To what extent does free will operate within a psyche seemingly pre-programmed for disconnect? If the neurological architecture of psychopathy predisposes an individual to a profound incapacity for empathy and remorse, if, for instance, the amygdala shows reduced reactivity to fear and distress cues, or if the prefrontal cortex exhibits atypical connectivity that impairs moral decision-making and emotional regulation, if the very neural pathways associated with moral processing and emotional resonance are atypical or diminished, can we genuinely speak of a choice to cultivate a spiritual heart, to embark upon a path of compassion or self-sacrifice? Or are we confronting a tragic manifestation of biological determinism, a deviation in the human blueprint that fundamentally alters the parameters of spiritual potential? This isn't a question posed to absolve, but rather to understand. It forces us to grapple with the inherent tension between personal responsibility and the undeniable influence of biological and environmental factors on our inner lives. How do we reconcile the deeply ingrained human belief in agency with the stark reality of inherent predispositions that seem to lock an individual into a particular mode of being? The question is not merely academic, it strikes at the very foundations of our moral and spiritual frameworks, challenging our assumptions about culpability, potential, and the universal applicability of spiritual paths. It forces us to ask, with a tremor of unease, whether there are some souls for whom the spiritual journey, as we commonly understand it, is simply not an option. The psychopath, in their chilling efficacy and lack of internal suffering, also forces us to re-examine the nature of evil. Is psychopathy an illness, a tragic deviation in the human blueprint, akin to a severe congenital defect of the soul? Or does it represent a darker, more primordial aspect of human potential, an expression of what some spiritual traditions might term unmitigated ego, or the lower self, unleashed without the tempering influence of conscience or divine light? The cold, calculated precision with which a psychopath can inflict harm, the effortless manipulation, and the instrumental view of others, seeing fellow human beings merely as tools or obstacles, challenge our simplistic binaries of good and evil. We are urged to consider whether evil is always a conscious choice, a deliberate turning away from the good, or if it can manifest as an inherent state, a fundamental lack rather than an active transgression. Is it the presence of malevolent intent, or the absence of the very faculties that make malevolence comprehensible? This perspective does not seek to excuse the devastating impact of psychopathic behavior, which leaves a trail of profound suffering in its wake. Instead, it seeks to deepen our understanding of its origins and implications, moving beyond punitive moralizing to a more complex, albeit unsettling hermeneutic that acknowledges the terrifying possibility of a human form devoid of the very spiritual architecture we assume is universal. It compels us to confront the possibility that some forms of destructive behavior stem not from a corruption of the soul, but from an inherent emptiness where a soul, as we define it, might otherwise reside. The implications for our established systems of justice and rehabilitation are equally stark. How does one rehabilitate an individual who experiences no internal suffering from their actions, no remorse and no desire for change because they perceive no flaw in their being or their behavior? Traditional therapeutic modalities often rely on the patient's capacity for introspection, empathy, and a desire to alleviate their own distress, or the distress they cause others. These are the foundational pillars upon which healing is built. Yet none of these prerequisites are present in the psychopath. They enter therapeutic settings not seeking change, but often seeking to master the language of change, to learn the cues and responses that will grant them an advantage. Their manipulation of therapeutic processes, their ability to mimic socially desirable behaviors without internalizing their meaning, offering seemingly profound insights or shedding strategic tears, and their fundamental lack of motivation for genuine internal transformation render most conventional approaches ineffective, if not counterproductive. Indeed, such interventions can inadvertently provide them with more sophisticated tools for deception. Justice systems, too, are predicated on the idea of culpability, remorse, and the potential for moral reform. The very concept of doing time as a path to redemption, or of restitution as a way to heal, assumes an internal mechanism that simply does not exist for the psychopath. Yet, for the psychopath, the very psychological bedrock upon which these concepts rest is either absent or profoundly distorted. This leaves us with a profound societal quandary. How do we protect ourselves from the destructive patterns of psychopathy while simultaneously grappling with its enigmatic nature, its resistance to conventional intervention, and the unsettling questions it poses about human potential and moral agency? The system, designed for the majority, finds itself utterly helpless before this anomaly, forced to resort to mere containment rather than any hope of genuine transformation. Indeed, the psychopath, in their chilling absence of conventional humanity, serves as a profoundly disturbing mirror for the collective human psyche. They reflect back to us the fragility of our own empathic capacities, how easily they can be eroded by circumstance or neglect. They highlight the ease with which instrumental rationality can divorce itself from ethical considerations, a phenomenon we see in less extreme forms in corporate greed, political maneuvering, or even everyday dismissiveness. They embody the ever-present shadow of our own potential for callousness, for using others, for prioritizing self-interest above all else. By observing the psychopath, we are forced to confront the darker aspects of human nature that often lie dormant or suppressed within ourselves. The desire for control, the temptation to exploit, the capacity for indifference, for a cold, calculating detachment from the suffering of others. They are an extreme yet potent manifestation of the human shadow, compelling us to engage in our own form of shadow work, to acknowledge and integrate those aspects of ourselves that we find uncomfortable or morally reprehensible. This isn't about identifying with the psychopath, but about recognizing the universal human susceptibility to ego-driven impulses that, left unchecked, could lead us down a path of increasing disconnection. In doing so, they become unwilling catalysts for our own self-reflection, forcing a re-evaluation of our collective moral compass and the constant vigilance required to nurture and protect the delicate tapestry of empathy and connection that binds humanity. It is a stark reminder that the battle for a compassionate world begins within each individual heart. This unsettling confrontation with psychopathy, therefore, transcends clinical diagnosis. It becomes a spiritual exercise in understanding the limits and possibilities of the human soul. It pushes us to the very edge of our understanding of consciousness, morality, and spiritual evolution. Our continued journey, then, must endeavour to explore these profound questions, seeking not easy answers, but a deeper, perhaps unsettling understanding of the human condition in its most extreme and enigmatic manifestations. We must inquire into what spiritual traditions, both ancient and modern, have posited regarding such states of being, whether they speak of soullessness, karmic burden, or a fundamental deviation from the divine spark, and how their wisdom might illuminate this most perplexing of human paradoxes. The exploration of psychopathy, in its chilling clarity, ultimately serves as a crucible for our own spiritual maturity, challenging us to expand our definitions of compassion and responsibility, even in the face of what appears to be an unbridgeable void. Our journey through the labyrinthine corridors of the psychopathic mind has thus far illuminated a stark, unsettling landscape. A clinical entity defined by an ego-syntonic constellation of interpersonal, affective, and behavioral deficits, yet simultaneously a profound spiritual riddle, an abyss of the unfelt. We have grappled with the absence of a discernible conscience, the void where empathy should reside, and the alarming imperviousness to the moral reverberations that typically guide human interaction. But what are the deeper implications of this absence? If the spiritual heart, that sacred locus of compassion, insight, and divine remembrance in countless traditions, is indeed dormant, calcified, or perhaps even absent in the psychopath, what does this signify for our understanding of consciousness, selfhood, and the very architecture of the soul? We must now venture beyond the descriptive phenomenology of psychopathy to confront its ontological challenge. What manner of self inhabits this inner landscape barren of remorse, devoid of the visceral pang of guilt, and untouched by the searing burn of shame? The clinical definition speaks of a grandiose sense of self-worth and a superficial charm, but these are often performative facades, instrumental tools in a perpetual game of manipulation. Beneath this polished exterior is there an authentic self, a core identity tethered to anything beyond immediate gratification and power? Or is the psychopathic self a perpetual chameleon, a series of calculated roles, utterly untethered to an internal moral compass or a stable emotional core? We are compelled to ask, does the psychopath possess a self in the way neurotypical individuals understand it? A continuous narrative woven from experience, reflection, and emotional resonance? Or is it a fragmented, purely functional construct designed solely for external navigation and exploitation. The absence of a heart in the spiritual sense suggests a profound departure from the conventional human experience of subjectivity. For most, the self is intimately intertwined with affect. Our memories are coloured by emotion, our decisions shaped by empathy, our sense of purpose often fueled by a desire for connection or contribution. The psychopath, however, appears unburdened by this intricate tapestry of emotional reciprocity. Their internal world is often described as one of instrumental rationality, where others are mere objects, resources to be leveraged, obstacles to be overcome. This perspective raises a disquieting question. If the self is not forged in the crucible of shared feeling and moral accountability, what then is its substance? Is it a purely cognitive processor, a sophisticated biological machine optimized for self-preservation and dominance, devoid of the very qualities we deem essential to personhood? This chilling proposition forces us to reconsider the very definition of what it means to be human, challenging the intuitive assumption that a rich inner life, replete with moral and emotional complexity, is a universal feature of conscious existence. This moral vacuum, this spiritual lacuna, inevitably casts a long shadow over our established frameworks of morality and justice. How do societies, predicated on a shared understanding of right and wrong, of empathy and accountability, contend with an individual who fundamentally operates outside these parameters? The psychopathic disregard for norms and the suffering of others is not born of a differing ideology or a passionate conviction, but rather from an intrinsic inability to feel the weight of moral consequence. When we speak of justice, we often invoke notions of deterrence, rehabilitation, and retribution, all of which presuppose a capacity for guilt, a desire for redemption, or at least a fear of punishment that registers on an emotional plane. But how does one deter a being who feels no shame, rehabilitate one who perceives no fault, or exact retribution from one who experiences no remorse? Their condition is, by definition, egosyntonic. They suffer no internal disquiet over their actions, rendering traditional therapeutic or punitive measures largely ineffective for genuine moral transformation. The challenge posed by psychopathy compels us to re-examine the very nature of evil. Is psychopathy a form of evil, or is it something else entirely, an amoral condition, a pathology that transcends our conventional moral judgments? If evil implies a conscious choice to inflict harm, a willful transgression against moral principles, then the psychopath's actions, while devastatingly harmful, might paradoxically fall outside this definition. For one cannot choose to transgress principles one does not genuinely perceive or value. This perspective does not diminish the catastrophic impact of psychopathic behavior, but rather shifts our understanding from one of malicious intent to one of profound existential deficit. It forces us to distinguish between the individual who chooses to do wrong despite knowing better, and the individual for whom knowing better, in a moral sense, is an inaccessible faculty. Such a distinction has profound implications for how we construct our legal systems, our ethical guidelines, and our spiritual interpretations of human suffering and accountability. Furthermore, the spiritual paradox deepens when we consider the concepts of free will and redemption. Many spiritual traditions posit that human beings are endowed with free will, the capacity to choose between good and evil, and that this choice is central to our spiritual journey and ultimate salvation. They also offer pathways to redemption through repentance, purification, and the cultivation of virtues like compassion and forgiveness. But if the psychopath lacks the foundational capacities for empathy and remorse, are their choices truly free in the moral sense? If their inner landscape is barren of the spiritual seeds from which compassion and repentance might grow, what path to purification exists for them? Does psychopathy represent a soul beyond redemption, a spiritual cul-de-sac that challenges the universal applicability of divine mercy and transformative grace? Or does it point to a different, perhaps terrifyingly alien spiritual trajectory altogether, one that operates outside the familiar paradigms of human moral development? This profound inquiry into the psychopathic condition inevitably turns the mirror back upon ourselves, urging us to confront our collective Stur and the fragility of our own empathic capacities. The existence of individuals who can operate with such callous disregard for others serves as a stark reminder of the constant vigilance required to cultivate and protect our own inner spiritual landscape. If the psychopath represents an extreme manifestation of a dormant heart, what does this tell us about the potential for spiritual barrenness within all humanity? Should we fail to nurture our own intrinsic capacities for compassion, connection, and moral reflection? The abyss of the unfelt in the psychopath is perhaps a magnified reflection of the potential for emotional and spiritual numbness that can afflict any of us, albeit to a lesser, more curable degree, when we allow ourselves to become desensitized, self-absorbed, or indifferent to the suffering of others. The journey into the psychopathic psyche is thus not merely an academic exercise in classification and understanding, it is a profound spiritual exercise in self-revelation. By meticulously dissecting the absence of certain qualities in the psychopath, we gain a renewed appreciation for the presence and necessity of those very qualities within ourselves and within the fabric of a healthy society. Empathy, conscience, remorse, the capacity for genuine love and connection, these are not merely pleasant human traits but essential components of our spiritual immune system, vital for navigating the intricate tapestry of relationships that define our existence. The psychopath, in the chilling otherness, compels us to cherish, cultivate, and defend these virtues, not just as moral imperatives, but as the very essence of our spiritual humanity. Their existence forces us to ask, what would we be without these capacities? What would our world become? The answer hauntingly lies in the very landscape we have explored, a world devoid of true connection, governed by instrumental rationality, and ultimately a spiritual wasteland. The ongoing quest to understand psychopathy is, therefore, an ongoing quest to understand and fortify the very soul of humanity. We have journeyed into the chilling architecture of the psychopathic mind, discerning its contours as a purely functional cognitive construct optimized for self-preservation and dominance, yet devoid of a moral or emotional core. This understanding, however, merely serves as the precipice from which we gaze into an even more profound and unsettling chasm, the implications of its egosyntonic nature. For it is not merely the absence of empathy, remorse, or guilt that defines this condition, but the complete absence of suffering from this absence. The psychopath does not yearn for what they lack. They do not perceive it as a deficit. Indeed, from their internal vantage point, this lack is often framed as an advantage, a liberation from the cumbersome emotional baggage that burdens neurotypical individuals. They experience an unshakable inner calm, a tranquil indifference to the very concepts that would shatter the peace of others. This fundamental contentment with their inner landscape, barren as it may appear to us, erects an almost impenetrable barrier to any conventional notion of change, redemption, or even understanding. It's a self-contained universe, perfectly ordered by its own amoral logic, where the internal experience is one of optimal functioning, not pathology. The idea of fixing something that for them isn't broken, is not only nonsensical but often met with a subtle disdain for the perceived weakness of those who would suggest it. How, then, do we reconcile this hermetic seal of egocentristicity with our deeply ingrained human frameworks of morality, free will, and spiritual potential? The question looms, a stark, unblinking eye upon the very nature of culpability and the possibility of transformation. If the individual experiences no internal dissonance, no visceral pang of regret, no searing burn of conscience, what impetus could possibly stir the stagnant waters of their being? The conventional levers of moral persuasion, guilt, shame, the desire for reconciliation, are entirely absent from their internal lexicon. Imagine trying to explain the colour red to someone born entirely blind. Their conceptual framework simply lacks the necessary sensory input to comprehend it. Similarly, the psychopath's internal world is devoid of the emotional receptors that would allow them to register guilt as a painful sting or shame as a corrosive acid. When confronted with the consequences of their actions, their response is typically one of detached calculation or strategic manipulation, not genuine remorse. They inhabit a reality where their actions, however destructive to others, are simply efficient means to desired ends, devoid of any inherent moral weighting. The tears of a victim, the anguish of a family, the societal outcry, these are merely external data points, noise to be filtered or exploited, never internal echoes that resonate with their own emotional core. Their world is one of pure instrumentality, where ethical considerations are merely social conventions to be navigated, not deeply felt imperatives. This brings us to the labyrinthine question of free will versus determinism. If, as neurological studies increasingly suggest, the psychopathic brain exhibits distinct structural and functional differences, an attenuated amygdala response, impaired connectivity in the prefrontal cortex that directly correlate with their affective and interpersonal deficits, to what extent can we speak of conscious choice in the traditional sense? These aren't subtle variations. They are fundamental deviations in the very neural architecture responsible for processing emotion, regulating impulse, and engaging in moral reasoning. The amygdala, often described as the brain's alarm system for fear and empathy, shows diminished activity, meaning emotional cues that would deter a neurotypical individual from harmful actions simply don't register with the same intensity. The prefrontal cortex, crucial for executive function and moral deliberation, displays compromised communication pathways, potentially hindering the integration of emotional feedback into decision-making. Are these individuals truly choosing to be callous, manipulative, and remorseless? Or are they operating within the confines of a neurobiological architecture that fundamentally limits their capacity for empathy and moral reasoning? The implications are staggering. If the very neural pathways that facilitate moral deliberation and emotional resonance are compromised, does the concept of free will, as applied to moral agency, become a moot point? We are confronted with a paradox, a being who performs acts of profound moral transgression, yet whose internal experience of those acts is entirely amoral, unburdened by the weight of intention or consequences understood by the empathic majority. This challenges the very bedrock of our justice systems, which are predicated upon the assumption of a rational, morally capable agent capable of choosing between right and wrong. To punish an individual for actions stemming from a fundamental inability to grasp their moral dimension raises uncomfortable ethical questions about the nature of justice itself, blurring the lines between crime, illness, and an entirely different mode of being. The very foundations of retribution and rehabilitation seem to crumble when faced with a mind that experiences no internal call for either. Furthermore, this pushes us to confront the very nature of what we label as evil. Is psychopathy an illness, an immoral condition, or a conscious manifestation of evil? If it is an illness, it is a peculiar one, for the patient experiences no suffering. Indeed, they often thrive, perceiving their unique constitution as an advantage in a world of weak and sentimental others. They navigate complex social landscapes with a predatory efficiency, unburdened by the anxieties, attachments, and ethical dilemmas that slow down or deter the majority. They can lie without compunction, exploit without regret, and charm without genuine warmth, often reaching positions of power and influence precisely because of their lack of conventional moral constraints. To label it an illness implies a deviation from a healthy state, yet for the psychopath, their state is their healthy, optimal mode of functioning. If it is an amoral condition, a state outside the moral spectrum, then our traditional concepts of good and evil simply do not apply. They are not choosing evil over good. They are operating in a dimension where such distinctions are meaningless, merely intellectual constructs to be mimicked or manipulated in others. For them, good is what serves their interests, and evil is what obstructs them, irrespective of any universal ethical standard. They might learn to mimic remorse or compassion if it yields a desired outcome, but these are purely performative acts, devoid of any internal correlate. Yet the effects of their actions are undeniably devastating, causing immense suffering and chaos, leading many to instinctively label them as evil. This tension between the internal experience of the psychopath and the external impact of their behavior on society creates an irreducible philosophical problem. Is evil defined by conscious intent or by destructive outcome? Psychopathy forces us to grapple with a form of destructive outcome that appears to lack the conscious malevolence we typically associate with evil, leaving us to wonder if there exists a form of cold evil, a purely functional malevolence that operates without the fiery passion of hatred or the dark pleasure of sadism, but with equally devastating results. This existential quandary becomes even more acute when viewed through a spiritual lens. Most spiritual traditions, in their myriad expressions, emphasize the purification of the heart, the cultivation of compassion, the pursuit of repentance, and the journey towards self-awareness and connection with a higher truth or divine essence. They speak of the soul's evolution, its capacity for growth, and its longing for reunion. But what of the psychopathic soul, if such a term can even be applied? The spiritual heart appears dormant, perhaps even absent, in its capacity for genuine feeling. There is no desire for repentance, for there is no perceived wrong to regret. The concept of sin or moral failing is a foreign language, a cultural construct that holds no personal sway. There is no longing for purification, for their internal world is deemed perfect as it is, pristine in its efficiency. The journey of self-awareness for them is merely an instrumental calibration of their own manipulative capacities, not a quest for deeper truth or moral rectitude. They engage in introspection only to refine their strategies for control and influence, never to confront an inner shadow or seek spiritual enlightenment. Does this imply a soul beyond redemption? Or more unsettlingly, does it suggest a fundamentally different spiritual architecture? An alien trajectory of being that operates outside the spiritual laws we understand. If the abyss of the unfelt is truly an unbridgeable chasm, then the spiritual frameworks that hinge on empathy, remorse, and the longing for connection find no purchase. The idea of a divine remembrance or a purification of the heart becomes an abstract concept, devoid of any resonance within their internal world. we are left to ponder whether psychopathy represents a profound spiritual lacuna, a soul perpetually arrested in its development, forever bound to a purely materialistic existence, or a testament to the sheer diversity of consciousness, some forms of which may simply not be amenable to the spiritual paths laid out by humanity. This challenges our anthropocentric assumptions about the universal nature of the soul and its inherent potential for spiritual growth, forcing us to consider if some consciousnesses are simply wired differently, existing on a parallel plane of being that does not intersect with our own spiritual aspirations. It raises the chilling possibility that not all beings are on the same journey, and that some may exist in a state of eternal, unperturbed spiritual isolation. The psychopath, in their ego-syntonic, effectively impoverished state, thus serves as a profound, unsettling mirror, forcing humanity to confront the very fragility of its own empathic capacities. It compels us to examine the potential for our own shadow aspects, self-interest, callousness, instrumental rationality, to run rampant, unchecked by the internal regulator of conscience. It's a stark reminder that the qualities we cherish most, compassion, connection, moral integrity, are not guaranteed, but rather require constant cultivation and defense against the encroaching darkness of pure expediency. The existence of psychopathy demands constant vigilance in the cultivation of compassion and connection, for the abyss reminds us what is lost when these qualities are absent. We are left with the chilling realization that while we seek to understand, to cure, to redeem, there may be certain modes of being that exist fundamentally outside our moral and spiritual gravity, impervious to our most earnest efforts to bridge the chasm of the unfelt. The challenge, then, is not merely to understand the psychopath, but to understand what their existence reveals about the boundaries and vulnerabilities of our own humanity, and to redouble our commitment to the very qualities that distinguish us from the profound indifference of the psychopathic mind. Having grappled with the clinical contours and the profound existential questions psychopathy unfurls, the enigmatic interplay of free will and determinism, the very nature of evil, and the haunting query regarding redemption for a soul seemingly bereft of the foundational capacities for remorse, we find ourselves drawn into a deeper vortex. The chasm between the neurotypical experience and the inner world of the psychopath yawns wider still, compelling us to confront not merely a deviation from the norm, but perhaps an entirely different paradigm of consciousness, a distinct mode of being that challenges the very essence of what we understand as human. What then does it mean for a being to exist within the human form, yet operate outside the very emotional and moral matrices that define our species? The abyss of the unfelt, a phrase we have employed to denote the psychopath's profound emotional barrenness, is more than a mere deficit. It is an architectonic feature of their inner landscape. Where others experience the rich tapestry of the emotional resonance, the searing burn of guilt, the visceral pang of empathy, the tender ache of love, the quiet solace of connection, the psychopath navigates a terrain devoid of such internal markers. Their world is one of stark utility, where interactions are transactional, relationships are instruments, and the intricate dance of human connection is reduced to a series of strategic maneuvers designed for personal gain. This internal vacuum is not perceived as a lack by the psychopath. Rather, it is often celebrated as a strength, a liberation from the weaknesses that plague the emotional human. This ego-syntonic embrace of their condition creates an almost impenetrable barrier to the traditional pathways of introspection, growth, or spiritual seeking. How can one seek to fill a void they do not perceive, or repair a structure they believe to be perfectly functional, even superior? The absence of conscience, clinically defined as a lack of remorse or guilt, assumes a far more profound significance when viewed through a spiritual lens. If, in many traditions, conscience is understood as the still small voice of the divine, an inner compass guiding the soul toward righteousness and away from transgression, then its complete obliteration in the psychopath suggests a spiritual disconnect of staggering proportions. Is it merely undeveloped, a faculty stunted in its nascent stages, or is it fundamentally absent? A core capacity never instantiated within their spiritual architecture. Without this internal arbiter, the moral universe collapses into an amoral void where actions are judged solely by their efficacy in achieving desired outcomes, irrespective of the suffering they inflict. This isn't merely a failure to act morally, it is a failure to perceive morality in its intrinsic, non-instrumental form. The psychopath, in this interpretation, exists outside the moral matrix that binds human communities, a solitary island in an ocean of shared ethical understanding, unmoored by the currents of collective responsibility or reciprocal care. The psychopath then serves as a chilling yet invaluable mirror. It forces us to examine the intricate architecture of our own moral and emotional landscapes, revealing the fragility of the foundations upon which we build our societies and our sense of self. What if the capacities we hold as universally human, empathy, compassion, the yearning for connection, the pang of guilt, are not in fact universal? What if they are precious, delicate faculties that require constant cultivation and protection? This mirror reflects not only the stark absence within the psychopath, but also the potential for erosion within the broader human psyche. It compels us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the boundaries of humanity might be more porous, more contested than we habitually assume, and that the abyss of the unfelt is not merely an external phenomenon, but a constant, albeit latent possibility within the collective human experience, a reminder of the vigilance required to maintain the integrity of our own hearts. The implications for our societal structures, particularly our systems of justice and ethics, are nothing short of revolutionary. If moral agency is predicated upon a capacity for empathy, remorse, and the discernment of right from wrong, capacities demonstrably attenuated or absent in the psychopath, then how do we justly assign responsibility, guilt, or the potential for rehabilitation? Our legal frameworks, rooted in the presumption of rational choice and moral culpability, falter at this precipice. Is punishment truly just for one who cannot grasp the moral weight of their transgression, who feels no internal suffering for their actions, and for whom the concept of reform holds no intrinsic meaning? The very notion of deterrence, built upon the fear of consequences and the sting of remorse, becomes moot when these internal mechanisms are non-existent. Psychopathy thus challenges the foundational assumptions of retributive justice, compelling us to consider alternative paradigms that acknowledge the profound otherness of this condition, perhaps shifting focus from moral blame to societal protection and the containment of harm without the illusion of moral rectification. The ego-syntonic nature of psychopathy, the fact that the individual experiences their condition not as a burden, but often as an advantage, presents an almost insurmountable spiritual dilemma. In most spiritual traditions, the path to purification, redemption, or enlightenment begins with a recognition of imperfection, a yearning for transcendence, a sorrow for one's misdeeds, or a suffering that impels the seeker towards a higher truth. Yet, for the psychopath, there is no such impetus. They perceive no flaw, feel no spiritual lack, experience no dark night of the soul that might precipitate a turning towards the divine. How then can a soul be redeemed if it perceives no need for redemption? Is divine grace contingent upon human receptivity? And if that receptivity is structurally absent, Does it imply a limit to grace itself, or perhaps a different, unfathomable pathway entirely? One that operates outside humanity's familiar paradigms of moral development and spiritual yearning? This question pries open the very fabric of theological understanding, forcing a confrontation with the limits of our anthropocentric spiritual paradigms. This profound otherness of the psychopath is not merely a quantitative difference in traits, it is a qualitative divergence in consciousness. It suggests an almost alien presence among us, one that wears the guise of humanity but operates by an entirely different internal logic. Their world is a theatre of masks, where emotions are mimicked, social cues are learned and deployed instrumentally, and the concept of genuine connection remains perpetually outside their experiential grasp. To encounter a psychopath is to peer into an existential void, to realize that the shared subjective reality we assume binds us all together is, for some, merely a convenient construct to be manipulated. This realization is profoundly unsettling, for it challenges our deep-seated need to find common ground, to believe in a universal human spirit, and to project our own internal states onto every conscious being. In our attempts to comprehend, to analyze, and perhaps even to cure, we, as observers, often extend our own empathic capacities to imagine the internal world of the psychopath. Yet this very act of empathetic projection inevitably encounters a void. We search for the common ground of suffering, of regret, of yearning, and find it absent. This encounter with the unfelt within the psychopath serves as a crucible for our own empathy, testing its limits and refining our understanding of its true nature. It teaches us that empathy is not merely a passive reception of another's feelings, but an active reciprocal engagement that requires a shared framework of emotional experience. When that framework is absent, empathy itself becomes a one-sided, perhaps even futile endeavour, underscoring the preciousness and vulnerability of our own capacity for connection and the profound isolation that must characterize the psychopath's inner existence. Thus, the journey into the inner psychology of the psychopath remains an unfinished expedition, perpetual interrogation of the deepest mysteries of human and perhaps non-human consciousness. It is a journey that compels us to reevaluate our most cherished assumptions about morality, free will, the nature of the soul, and the very definition of what it means to be a sentient, morally accountable being. The psychopath stands as a stark reminder that the human experience is far more complex, far more variegated, and perhaps far more terrifying than we typically allow ourselves to acknowledge. Their existence is a profound spiritual riddle, an enduring challenge to our understanding of the divine, and an urgent call for humanity to vigilantly cultivate the very capacities, empathy, conscience, and genuine connection that define our shared moral universe, lest the abyss of the unfelt subtly expand and engulf the fragile foundations of our collective human spirit. We have journeyed thus far into the stark, unsettling landscape of psychopathy, a realm that defies the very coordinates of our shared humanity. Imagine a vast, desolate terrain, not barren of life, but barren of the internal echoes that give meaning to existence for most, a place where the conventional cartography of human experience, meticulously charted with landmarks of empathy, the winding rivers of remorse, and the intricate tapestry of emotional connection, appears tragically and profoundly absent. Our exploration has consistently circled back to the abyss of the unfelt, that chilling egosyntonic void where the visceral pang of guilt, the searing burn of shame, or the gentle ache of compassion simply do not register. It's not merely a quiet absence, a faint whisper unheard. It is a fundamental non-experience, a neurological and psychological blank slate where these profound human responses should be. This absence, we contend, is far more than a mere deficit. It is the very bedrock upon which the psychopathic edifice stands, a foundation that allows for a chillingly rational yet emotionally detached navigation of the world. Consequently, traditional frameworks of morality designed for beings who feel the weight of their actions, justice systems built on the premise of a shared moral compass, and crucially, spiritual paradigms predicated on the heart's capacity for repentance and longing, are rendered profoundly inadequate. The psychopath, existing without internal suffering, without the gnawing disquiet of a troubled conscience that might prompt introspection or change, presents a spiritual riddle of the highest order. It compels us to question our most cherished assumptions about the human soul, its inherent nature, its potential for divine remembrance, and indeed, the very universality of a spiritual journey as we understand it. The mind grapples with the sheer implications, a being seemingly complete yet devoid of the very internal mechanisms that define our spiritual potential. How then do we reconcile this intrinsic spiritual barrenness, this inner landscape devoid of the fertile ground for introspection and repentance, with the universal human quest for meaning, connection, and spiritual evolution? Traditional spiritual paths across diverse traditions, be it the Abrahamic calls for confession and redemption, the Buddhist emphasis on compassion and the cessation of suffering, or the various indigenous traditions valuing interconnectedness and reverence, invariably commence with a recognition of imperfection, a yearning for purification of the heart, or a deep-seated desire to transcend the ego's limitations. Suffering, often understood as a profound catalyst for growth, a crucible for the soul that refines and transforms, plays a pivotal, often indispensable role in these arduous journeys. It is through the encounter with pain, loss, and moral falling that many awaken to a deeper spiritual reality. Yet for the psychopath, the very concept of suffering in this spiritual or emotional sense is utterly alien. Their condition is, by definition, ego-syntonic. It causes them no internal distress, no gnawing sense of unease, no impetus for change, no longing for a different state of being. They perceive no fault in their actions, feel no remorse for the harm they inflict, and consequently possess no internal drive to seek redemption or spiritual awakening as we understand it. The very idea of atonement, a cornerstone of many spiritual belief systems, simply has no purchase in their inner world. This absence of internal suffering, this imperviousness to the moral weight of their actions and the pain of others, creates an unbridgeable chasm between their inner world and the spiritual aspirations that define much of humanity. We, who feel the tug of conscience, struggle to comprehend a life lived without its constant, albeit sometimes subtle guidance. This brings us to the perennial philosophical conundrum of free will versus determinism, now cast in a spiritual light that is both chilling and profoundly disquieting. If, as neuroscience increasingly suggests, psychopathy is rooted in demonstrable neurological differences, attenuated amygdala responses that blunt emotional processing, impaired prefrontal cortex connectivity affecting impulse control and moral reasoning, and a typical reward system functioning that prioritizes immediate gratification. To what extent are the psychopath's actions truly chosen? If the very architecture of their brain predisposes them to a lack of empathy, a diminished capacity for moral reasoning, and an inability to process emotional cues in a manner conducive to prosocial behavior, where does moral responsibility truly reside? The question gnaws at the very fabric of our understanding of culpability. Are we to view their spiritual heart as inherently dormant, a seed that cannot sprout due to infertile soil, a biological predisposition that precludes spiritual engagement? Or is it a conscious rejection of the divine, a deliberate turning away from the light, regardless of neurological wiring? This question is not merely academic, it strikes at the core of our understanding of divine justice, individual accountability before a higher power, and the very nature of the soul itself. Can one be held morally or spiritually culpable for an absence of capacity, for a fundamental difference in the very fabric of their consciousness that prevents them from perceiving the world, and indeed the divine, in the way neurotypical individuals do? The implications force us to confront the limits of our judgment and the potential for a reality far more complex than our binary notions of good and evil typically allow. The implications of this ego-syntonic state ripple outward, forcing us to confront not only the individual psychopath but also the collective shadow of humanity. The existence of psychopathy, with its unyielding indifference and instrumental rationality, holds up a disturbing mirror to society, reflecting back uncomfortable truths about our own vulnerabilities. It compels us to ask, how robust is our own empathy in the face of convenience or gain? How easily can compassion be eroded in the relentless pursuit of self-interest, group affiliation, or under the immense weight of societal pressures? The psychopath, in their unburdened pursuit of gratification and power, serves as a stark reminder of the inherent fragility of human empathy, a chilling warning against the spiritual barrenness that can creep into any collective if the deliberate cultivation of connection, compassion, and ethical awareness is neglected. We are forced to engage in an uncomfortable internal dialogue. Do we, in our own pursuit of comfort, success, or ideological purity, sometimes lapse into a similar objectification of others, albeit on a less extreme scale? Do we dismiss the suffering of those outside our immediate circle, or rationalize injustices that benefit us, thereby creating smaller, localized abysses of the unfelt within our own communities? The psychopath, in their extreme form, might be seen as a magnified reflection of the potential for callous disregard that lurks within the human psyche, potential that, when unchecked, can lead to a collective abyss of the unfelt, manifesting in ruthless corporate strategies, dehumanizing economic systems, or violently exclusionary political ideologies. The mirror shows us not just an anomaly, but a spectrum, and we are left to ponder where we, as individuals and as a society, stand upon it. This profound divergence in consciousness also forces a re-evaluation of what it means to be human, and by extension, what constitutes a soul in the traditional sense. If a soul is understood as the seat of consciousness, emotion, morality, and the capacity for spiritual growth and connection to the divine, a vessel for conscience and a yearning for transcendence, then the psychopathic soul presents an unsettling paradox. Is it a soul without these attributes? A mere shell devoid of the animating spiritual spark? Or is it a fundamentally different kind of soul altogether, operating on principles we cannot yet grasp? Can a being who experiences no internal conflict, no yearning for transcendence, no sense of cosmic belonging or moral obligation, ever truly engage with the spiritual journey as we define it? The very notion of redemption, often predicated on an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a profound remorse, and a fervent desire for atonement and change, seems utterly inapplicable to an individual who perceives no fault and feels no remorse. We are left to ponder whether their spiritual trajectory, if it exists at all, operates on a fundamentally different, perhaps alien, plane, beyond the scope of our current understanding and anthropocentric spiritual frameworks. Is it possible that the divine, in its infinite and inscrutable wisdom, has woven into the intricate tapestry of existent souls that are impervious to the very threads of connection and compassion that bind the rest of creation? This question, unsettling as it is, speaks to the limits of our human-centric spiritual paradigms and demands a humility in acknowledging the vastness of the divine plan, which may encompass forms of being and spiritual paths far beyond our current comprehension. The persistent riddle of psychopathy thus remains, challenging the very foundations of our spiritual and ethical systems with an unyielding force. We find ourselves at the precipice of a profound inquiry, where established notions of good and evil, free will and determinism, redemption and damnation, must be re-examined through a lens that acknowledges the qualitative divergence in human consciousness. The psychopath, in their unyielding embrace of the self and their profound indifference to the other, forces us to confront the deepest questions about the nature of humanity, the limits of our empathy, and the true meaning of a spiritual path. As we continue to delve into these unsettling depths, we are not merely studying a clinical phenomenon. We are engaging with a fundamental challenge to our collective understanding of what it means to possess a soul, and whether that soul, in all its myriad forms and expressions, is ever truly beyond the reach of the divine. The exploration demands not only intellectual rigor, a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, but also a profound humility, a recognition that the universe's spiritual architecture may be far more complex than our current doctrines allow. For the abyss of the unfelt may yet hold truths that transcend our most cherished spiritual paradigms, forcing us to expand our very definition of what it means to be, and to be spiritually alive. The profound challenge of psychopathy, as we have meticulously explored, extends far beyond the clinical diagnostic criteria, piercing the very heart of our collective human understanding. It compels us to confront not merely a deviation from the norm, a statistical anomaly in the vast spectrum of human behavior, but a fundamental re-evaluation of what it signifies to possess a soul, to embody moral accountability, and to embark upon a spiritual trajectory. The very fabric of our shared moral universe seems to fray at the edges when confronted with this enigma. One cannot help but wonder, with a chilling sense of existential dread, are there indeed souls beyond redemption, beings whose intrinsic nature places them outside the conventional pathways of spiritual growth and reconciliation? Or do these enigmatic individuals traverse paths so utterly divergent from our own, operating on a different energetic frequency, that they reside in an entirely different spiritual dimension, a realm of unfathomable purpose or tragic design, perhaps a cosmic experiment gone awry, or an essential, albeit terrifying, component of a larger, incomprehensible tapestry? This question, a searing brand upon the canvas of our spiritual inquiry, demands further contemplation, pulling us deeper into the abyss of the unfelt and the perplexing silence of the unremorseful heart, a silence that echoes with the weight of unanswered prayers and unexamined moral assumptions. It is a thought that chills the very marrow, forcing us to ask if the boundaries of the human spirit are far more porous and far more terrifyingly diverse than our comforting anthropocentric narratives allow. We are thus drawn back to the epicenter of our investigation, the spiritual barrenness, the abyss of the unfelt, which defines the psychopath's inner landscape. This is not merely an absence of feeling, but a profound, almost geological void, a chasm where the echoes of human connection, the subtle vibrations of shared emotion, simply do not resonate. From a purely spiritual vantage, how do various traditions, both ancient and contemporary, grapple with a being seemingly devoid of that quintessential spiritual organ, the conscience, the seat of empathy, the crucible of remorse? Consider the great spiritual teachings, from Buddhism's emphasis on compassionate interconnectedness to Christianity's call for penitence and brotherly love, or even indigenous wisdom traditions that highlight the sacred web of life. All presuppose a fundamental capacity for inner experience, for suffering and joy, for the recognition of self in the other. In the vast tapestry of human spiritual experience, suffering often serves as the profound catalyst for growth, a purifying fire that refines the ego and opens the heart to deeper truths, forging resilience and wisdom. The dark night of the soul, a concept deeply entrenched in mystical traditions from St. John of the Cross to Sufi masters, describes a period of intense spiritual desolation, a purging of attachments and illusions, leading ultimately to a more profound union with the divine. Yet the psychopath's condition is emphatically not this. There is no dark night, for there is no yearning for dawn, no inner longing for light to break through the spiritual gloom, no purging, for there is no perceived impurity, no internal recognition of moral failing that would necessitate such an arduous cleansing, no suffering of the spirit, for the spirit itself appears dormant, perhaps even absent in the conventional sense, a landscape barren of the seeds of spiritual yearning. The ego, far from being refined, is often hypertrophied, a monumental edifice of self-regard perfectly synchronized with its own lack of moral constraint, experiencing its profound detachment not as a deficit, a flaw to be overcome, but as an undeniable, almost exhilarating advantage in the ruthless game of life. For them, the absence of guilt is not a void, but a liberation, empathy a weakness to be exploited, and moral boundaries mere suggestion for the less astute. This presents a paradox of staggering proportions, a logical knot that unravels the very foundations of our spiritual understanding. If spiritual evolution is predicated upon the recognition of imperfection, the visceral pang of regret that twists the gut, the searing burn of guilt that shames the soul, and the subsequent yearning for purification and reconciliation, a profound desire to mend what is broken within and without, then what is the trajectory for one who experiences none of these? What becomes of divine remembrance, the inherent spark of the sacred believed to reside within all beings, when the mirror reflecting divine attributes, compassion, justice, interconnectedness, unconditional love, is not merely clouded by ego or distorted by trauma, but appears utterly shattered, or perhaps was never fully formed to begin with, a fundamental piece of the cosmic puzzle irrevocably missing. We are compelled to question if the spiritual heart in such an individual is not merely calcified, hardened by neglect or circumstance, but fundamentally structured differently, operating on principles utterly alien to our own, a spiritual DNA coded with an entirely different set of directives. We find ourselves grappling with the unsettling possibility that the very mechanisms of spiritual awakening as understood within our anthropocentric frameworks, those pathways carved by millennia of human experience and divine revelation, are simply inapplicable to this unique and disturbing manifestation of human existence. It is as if they are playing a different game, by different rules, on a different board entirely. Such an inquiry inevitably challenges our most cherished frameworks of theodicy and divine justice, forcing us to confront the limits of our theological explanations for suffering and evil. If, as neurological studies suggest with enlacing clarity, psychopathy is profoundly influenced by attenuated amygdala responses, impaired prefrontal cortex connectivity, and other demonstrable biological factors that impact emotional processing and decision-making, to what extent are the actions of a psychopath truly chosen in the same moral sense as those of a neurotypical individual? Does this biological predisposition mitigate or even negate traditional notions of sin and culpability, those deeply ingrained concepts of personal responsibility before a divine arbiter? Is the psychopath a test of faith, a tragic flaw in creation, an unavoidable imperfection in the grand design, or an entirely distinct category of being that exists beyond our dualistic understanding of good and evil, operating in a moral vacuum that our existing philosophies struggle to categorize. The concept of cold evil, an evil born not of malicious intent or conscious, deliberate choice to inflict suffering out of hatred or spite, but of a fundamental innate absence of the capacity to feel the suffering of others, to register their pain or distress, forces us to grapple with a profound ontological distinction. It is not an active force of destruction in the traditional sense, a raging inferno of malevolence, but rather a vacuum, a spiritual black hole, an absence of the very qualities that bind humanity together in a web of mutual understanding and compassion. This leaves a wake of devastation not through deliberate malice, but through sheer, unfeeling indifference, a calculating disregard that is perhaps even more terrifying than passionate cruelty. This challenges the very bedrock of our moral philosophies, which so often presuppose a baseline capacity for empathy and remorse, for a shared human experience of right and wrong that for the psychopath simply does not exist. The existence of psychopathy, therefore, casts a chilling reflection upon the collective human psyche, compelling us to confront our own shadow aspects, our own potential for detachment, objectification, and spiritual apathy. How often do societies, in their pursuit of efficiency or power, mirror the psychopath's cold rationality, sacrificing empathy for perceived advantage? How does society's response to psychopathy, its fear, its fascination, its attempts at containment or rehabilitation, reflect its own spiritual health, its own capacity for true understanding and compassion, even in the face of the utterly incomprehensible? Is there a danger, a profound ethical pitfall, in projecting our anthropocentric moral frameworks and our deeply ingrained fears onto something that may operate on an entirely different plane of existence, misinterpreting its nature through the lens of our own limitations? We as a species tend to define humanity by its capacity for empathy, love, and connection, by the intricate dance of shared emotions and reciprocal care. When confronted with a being that fundamentally lacks these attributes, that thrives in their absence, we are forced to re-examine the very boundaries of our definition, to ask if the human experience is broader, more diverse, and perhaps more terrifyingly varied than we have ever dared to imagine. It forces us to peer into the abyss of non-humanity dwelling within human form, and to question what it truly means to be us. This brings us to the most unsettling question, the one that whispers of ultimate finality, beyond redemption. If the very mechanisms that lead to remorse, to the poignant sting of regret, and to the desire for change and spiritual growth are absent, what does redemption even signify for a psychopath? Traditional spiritual paths often emphasize repentance, forgiveness, and the purification of the heart as crucial, non-negotiable steps towards spiritual liberation and union with the divine. Yet how does one repent for actions that cause no internal suffering, no moral stain upon the conscience, no gnawing feeling of having transgressed? How does one seek forgiveness for deeds that are perceived as logical, efficient, or simply inconsequential in the grand scheme of one's self-serving existence, mere tools to achieve a desired outcome, devoid of any emotional or moral weight? The spiritual challenge of unconditional love, a cornerstone of many traditions, is stretched to its absolute limits when confronted with a being seemingly incapable of reciprocity, genuine connection, or transformation through conventional means. It asks us to love without expectation of return, without the comfort of shared humanity, pushing the very definition of compassion to its breaking point. This raises the profound question of whether the concept of unfathomable spiritual trajectories might indeed hint at a broader, more complex cosmic order, one in which some beings might follow paths so divergent from our own that our current spiritual maps, our carefully constructed theological frameworks, simply do not apply. Perhaps their path, if it exists, lies beyond our current understanding of cause and effect, beyond our limited notions of moral progress and spiritual evolution, existing in a dimension of purpose that remains utterly opaque to our empathy-bound consciousness. Ultimately, the phenomenon of psychopathy compels us to cultivate a profound humility in the face of the unknown. It demands that we acknowledge the vastness of existence and the inherent limitations of our current understanding, both scientific and spiritual, urging us to step back from the comfort of definitive answers. It forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that some aspects of reality, some manifestations of consciousness, may simply transcend our capacity for full comprehension, existing in a realm that defies our attempts to categorize, explain, or even empathize. This ongoing quest for understanding, even in the face of the profoundly disturbing and the intellectually disorienting, is not an act of morbid fascination, but a necessary step in our collective spiritual journey, an evolution of our consciousness. It is an invitation to expand our consciousness, to challenge our preconceptions about what is possible and what is sacred, and to humbly accept that the universe, and indeed the human spirit, may hold mysteries far grander and far more unsettling than our current philosophies and spiritual frameworks can yet encompass. The psychopath stands as a chilling sentinel at the edge of this vast unknown, a silent, unblinking challenge to our most cherished beliefs about what it means to be human, to be moral, and to possess a soul, forever pushing the boundaries of our spiritual inquiry into uncharted, desolate territories. The qualitative divergence in consciousness that psychopathy presents is not merely a deviation from the norm, a statistical anomaly on a bell curve of human behavior. It is a fundamental re-architecture of being, a challenge to the very bedrock of our anthropocentric paradigms. We, as a species, are instinctively inclined to assume a shared, fundamental internal experience, believing that beneath superficial differences, all human minds operate with a similar emotional and moral infrastructure. Yet, here we are confronted with a human form that, while sharing our biological blueprint down to the last chromosome, operates under an entirely different internal operating system, one demonstrably bereft of the emotional and moral software that underpins our shared reality. This isn't a glitch in the system, it's a system designed on different principles, with a different core logic. This is where the profound, unsettling nature of psychopathy truly crystallizes, pushing the boundaries of what we understand as human and forcing us to interrogate the universality of our most cherished ethical and spiritual assumptions. It compels us to ask, with a shiver of intellectual discomfort, if our very definition of consciousness has been too narrowly drawn, too self-referential, to encompass the full spectrum of human internal experience. What does it signify for our understanding of humanity when a segment of our species appears intrinsically incapable of experiencing the very emotions that define our capacity for connection, for remorse, for love? If empathy, conscience, and the capacity for genuine attachment are considered cornerstones of human experience, the essential mortar binding our societies and defining our personal relationships, then the psychopath, by their very nature, exists beyond these foundational pillars. Their inner landscape, devoid of the visceral pang of guilt that twists the stomach of the neurotypical individual, or the searing burn of compassion that compels us to aid another's suffering, is not merely impoverished, it is rather structured differently, optimize for instrumental rationality and the unburdened pursuit of self-interest. To them, the abyss of the unfelt is not a void to be mourned or a deficit to be overcome. It is a functional space, an absence that facilitates their unique mode of existence. This absence allows for a cold, calculating efficiency, a strategic clarity unencumbered by the messy complexities of human sentiment, enabling them to navigate social landscapes with an almost predatory focus, free from the internal friction of moral quandaries or emotional entanglements. It is a world where the emotional static that clouds the judgments of others simply does not exist. This realization compels us to reevaluate the very definition of humanity itself. Is it solely a biological classification, a matter of DNA and anatomy, or does it fundamentally encompass a spectrum of internal capacities, a shared emotional and moral grammar that dictates our interactions and our very sense of self? If the latter holds true, then the psychopath forces an uncomfortable distinction, suggesting a profound internal otherness within our own species. We are not merely observing a disorder, a malfunction of an otherwise standard human mind. We are glimpsing a fundamentally different way of experiencing consciousness, a parallel reality existing within the same physical realm. This qualitative divergence is not about a difference in degree, a less intense feeling or a slightly skewed perspective, but in kind, a wholly distinct mode of operating. It poses an existential riddle that eludes easy categorization or simplistic moral condemnation, challenging the very notion of a single universal human subjective experience. The philosophical implications ripple outward, disturbing established frameworks and demanding a recalibration of what it means to be a conscious being walking among others. The implications for universal spiritual principles are even more disquieting, striking at the heart of millennia-old beliefs. Most spiritual traditions across cultures and epochs posit a universal potential for awakening, for divine remembrance, for the purification of the heart. These paths invariably assume an inherent capacity for self-reflection, for remorse, for the cultivation of virtues like compassion, forgiveness, and selfless love. They speak of a spiritual heart that can be awakened through diligent practice and introspection, a soul that can be guided towards higher truths, towards enlightenment or salvation. The underlying assumption is that, given the right conditions and effort, every human being possesses the intrinsic emotional and moral architecture to undertake this journey, to feel the pang of conscience that drives repentance, or the surge of empathy that fuels selfless acts. It is a promise of universal accessibility to spiritual growth, a hopeful vision for all of humanity. But what if this spiritual heart in certain individuals appears not merely dormant, awaiting activation, but fundamentally absent or structured in a way that renders these traditional pathways inaccessible? If the psychopath lacks the internal mechanisms for guilt or genuine empathy, how can they truly engage in repentance, which requires an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a sincere desire for atonement arising from an internal sense of moral transgression? Such an act, for them, would be a mere performative gesture, devoid of the deep emotional resonance that defines it for others. If the concept of selfless love is an alien construct, a foreign language they cannot comprehend, how can they cultivate compassion, which demands an ability to feel with and for another, to genuinely share in their suffering or joy? The very language of spiritual transformation, words like contrition, grace, heartfelt devotion, seems to falter and lose its meaning when confronted with this profound internal barrenness. We are left questioning whether the divine remembrance is truly universal, or if some souls, by their intrinsic architecture, are set upon unfathomable spiritual trajectories that lie entirely outside the conventional human experience of growth and redemption. This isn't to condemn, for condemnation requires a shared moral ground. It is rather to acknowledge a profound conceptual challenge, a spiritual lacuna that demands our intellectual honesty. Can a spiritual system built entirely on shared emotional and moral assumptions truly encompass a consciousness that operates without them? The question hangs heavy, unsettling the very foundations of our spiritual optimism. This forces us to confront the limits of our own anthropocentric spiritual and ethical paradigms, revealing them not as universal truths, but as frameworks tailored to a specific mode of human consciousness. We tend, quite naturally, to project our internal world, our capacity for suffering and joy, our innate sense of justice and injustice, our longing for connection, onto all human experience. We assume that others feel as we do, that their internal struggles and motivations mirror our own. Psychopathy shatters this projection with brutal efficiency, revealing a chasm where we assumed continuity. It suggests that our revered frameworks, however ancient and deeply ingrained, might be inherently limited, designed for a particular kind of consciousness, the neurotypical, empathetically wired one, that may not in fact be universal. The spiritual riddle deepens, asking us to consider whether there are modes of existence, even within human form, that defy our most cherished notions of spiritual potential and moral accountability, pushing the boundaries of what we can even conceive as a soul's journey. Furthermore, this divergence challenges our capacity for understanding itself, striking at the very core of our epistemology. How can we truly comprehend, let alone empathize with, an absence of empathy? It is an intellectual and emotional paradox. Our attempts to grasp the psychopath's inner world often involve an unconscious but persistent projection of our own feelings of what it must be like to lack these capacities, a kind of phantom limb syndrome of the soul. We imagine the emptiness, the sorrow, the yearning for what is missing. But for the psychopath, there is no phantom limb. There is simply no limb at all, and thus no memory or longing for its presence. Their reality is complete within its own parameters, unburdened by the emotional weight, the internal conflicts, the regrets, or the moral anxieties that define ours. This makes genuine understanding an almost impossible feat, pushing us to the very edge of our cognitive and emotional faculties. We are left grappling with an otherness that is simultaneously human in its biological form and profoundly alien in its subjective experience, existing within our midst yet operating on an entirely different plane of internal reality. The intellectual struggle to bridge this chasm is immense, often leaving us feeling inadequate and profoundly disoriented. The profound otherness of the psychopath, then, serves as a disturbing mirror not just for our potential for detachment, but for the inherent limitations of our own subjective experience. It forces us to acknowledge that our understanding of consciousness, morality, and spirituality is deeply rooted in our own internal wiring, our shared emotional matrix, a matrix that for some simply doesn't exist. When confronted with a consciousness that fundamentally diverges from this matrix, our conventional tools for understanding, for judgment, and for intervention, be they therapeutic, legal, or moral, prove woefully inadequate. We speak of rehabilitation, punishment, moral education, but these concepts presuppose an internal landscape capable of processing guilt, fear of consequence, or a desire for connection. In the absence of these, our most sophisticated approaches often fall flat, like trying to teach a fish to climb a tree, reinforcing the unsettling realization that our methods are designed for a different kind of being. This existential confrontation compels us towards a deeper, more nuanced inquiry, one that transcends simplistic notions of good and evil, health and illness. It demands that we look beyond the surface behaviours and attempt to grasp the qualitative difference in their very mode of being, to understand the architecture of a mind that functions without the very emotional pillars we consider universal. The unanswered mystery is not merely why they are this way, in terms of neurological or developmental origins, but what it means for the broader tapestry of human existence, for our philosophical frameworks, and for our spiritual aspirations. The psychopath stands as a living paradox, a human enigma that continues to challenge our most fundamental assumptions about shared consciousness and the universal human spirit. Their existence insists that we expand our intellectual and spiritual horizons, even if it means confronting the unsettling possibility that some forms of consciousness may lie forever beyond the grasp of our conventional understanding, perpetually shrouded in an impenetrable subjective reality. The journey into the inner psychology of the psychopath, therefore, becomes a journey into the uncharted territories of consciousness itself, a humbling exploration of the vast and perhaps terrifying spectrum of human experience, forcing us to redefine the very boundaries of the human soul.